Hi, and welcome to Professor Black's History. Of course, always coming to you from the shadows until African American and Black history is placed more prominently in history textbooks. Now, of course, we don't come to you to give you a whole history lesson. What I try to do is just give you a name or two of some people you may never have heard of, and you want to look them up. You may even have heard of these people sometimes, but still, go back and read the whole story and put it into context. Put it back in the day and think of how it really was for them to achieve the things they did. One of the stories many people never heard of was the story of Chief John Horse. Now, many African Americans in our country consider themselves part Native American, and it could be so because Native Americans and African Americans in this country have a big history. And it's too complicated for me to try to explain here, but go back and read about the Black Indians. You'll be amazed, and you might even look at your own lineage and find that you may have some of this blood in you as well. But Chief John Horse was actually a Black Seminole. He was born of Spanish, African American, and Seminole native blood, and he was a chief, a war chief for Chief Osceola during the Second Seminole War. And John Horse was a great chief, but he was also a great negotiator. And many African Americans actually lived with the Seminole. For example, I bet many people don't think of the fact that when they talk about the Underground Railroad of slaves escaping to freedom, many people don't think about slaves escaping south to Florida or South America. But if you were a slave in South Carolina or Georgia, that was probably the closest free place you could go while the Spanish owned Florida. But of course America eventually owned Florida, and they wanted to get the Native Americans out of there, and for years the Seminoles and the African American Seminoles, they all fought against the United States Army. And John Horse was a major factor. He was a war chief actually, and he led many battles against the United States. But eventually, they all gave up and decided to move to Indian Territory, which is today Oklahoma. So John Horse and his people moved, but he got his freedom from the war, but his wife and children still were considered slaves. So they were subjected to slave catchers. Them and the other African Americans and African American Seminoles, they were all subjected to slave catchers coming to Oklahoma to take them and capture them back into slavery. So they eventually went to Mexico, and he and his good friend Cocochi led the African Americans and the African American Native Americans, or Seminole, and the Seminoles into Mexico, where they were free. Now, John Horse also enlisted in or became a part of the Mexican Army. He actually rose to the rank of general in the Mexican Army. And after the American Civil War, the United States Army came and asked the Seminole Native Americans, or the African American Seminoles rather, to become scouts for their U.S. Army. So the Native Americans and the African Americans intermingled many years all throughout the history of the United States. It's a fascinating story to read about, not just John Horse, but about Black Indians in general. Actually, it's one of my favorite stories, and I just love this stuff. I hope you do too. We'll talk to you next time right here on Professor Black's History.